Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The results from India's monstrously huge electoral exercise are out. Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party has won big, bagging, according to official data, 301 seats, up from 282 in 2014. The opposition Indian National Congress has won 52, up from 44 in 2014, but clearly inconsequential. Pundits within India in the run-up to the polls, as also while the seven-phase exercise involving nearly 900 million voters was going on, spoke mostly along partisan and ideological lines. Modi's past 5 years were at best a mixed bag. Unrest among farmers, the negative fallout of demonetization on small and medium businesses, highest unemployment rate in 2 decades, no movement on the promise of creating smart cities in the Deccan Plateau, no cleaning of the Ganges, India's sacred river, cooked-up growth figures and stuttering economy, etc. Even on development, voices differed. So what was at play here? What caused the high tide? Most analysts say it's about nationalism and Hindu majoritarianism. Whatever other factors might be at play in regional pockets, and they must be, these two broad strands are and were visible to most observers within and without India. Pragya Singh Thakur, accused of terror attacks against Muslims, got the BJP ticket, making her a metaphor for Modi's BJP and the centrality of the Hindutva ideology. Is this a negation of the secular inclusiveness that Pandit Nehru sought to inject in India's body politic, and which was given a constitutional framework by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar? It is ironic that November 26 was marked as the Constitution Day of India by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2015 as a part of year-long celebration of the 125th birth anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar famously said, and I quote, that we must not be content with mere political democracy. We must note that our political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life, unquote. Voting is an important baseline process for democratic succession principle, but while it is necessary, it is not sufficient. Ambedkar stood for inclusiveness. Modi, by all indications in the past 5 years, has presided over a Hindutva project of Hindu primacy and essentialism. Although to the extent of Twitter, he said after the victory speech, and I quote, "Together we grow, together we prosper, together we will build a strong and inclusive India. India wins yet again," unquote. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Prime Minister has congratulated Mr. Modi on his win and asked him to partner with him in bringing peace to the region. Modi has responded by saying, "I warmly express my gratitude for your good wishes. I've always given primacy to peace and development in our region." What is India, and by extension the region, looking at in the next 5 years is what we shall discuss tonight. Of course, our discussion will, of necessity, include questions related to India-Pakistan relations. We have with us Ashok Swain, who's an Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Uppsala University in Sweden, and Dr. Moeed Yusuf, who's an Associate Vice President, Asia at USIP. Professor Swain, I know you've been with us yesterday also, but give me a sense of how the liberal secular enclave in India is likely to react to this. I was looking at Twitter, and some of the people responded to my tweets also, and they said that do not count us out as yet. Would you agree with that sentiment that over 70 years of liberal secularism is not about to go away, and if Modi moves any further to extreme right, that there's going to be a pushback?
I think they are probably hopeful, but I don't think how much that hope really stands on the reality. The question is, looking at the last 5 years, when Modi came with slogan, again, of course, it is Sabke Saath, Sabka Vikas, And then development, he was selling the Gujarat model. He was not talking at all about the Muslim things. He was not talking about Pakistan. He was absolutely out of that mostly. He was mostly focusing on that, how he can bring development and how can take the country out of the corruptions, whatever happening in the second half of the UPA administration. And after coming that, he did a number of things which he didn't succeed, because the kind of things, you have to, considering India as a country of that size and that character, you cannot alone to push this forward in economic terms. So there has been lots of crisis in the economic front, farming front, a number of decisions which he took without having any thought through processes, which is like a demonetization. So then he swiftly moved towards the anti-Muslim agenda. And then what you said in your initial remarks, this was also to some extent was getting not really working till the end, because till December last year, it was, at least you could see that there is lots of apprehension that he might not win. So the opposition was getting strengthened. But at the same time, the Balakot happened. After the Pulwama Balakot happened, the opposition didn't know how to react to it. There is a lot of propaganda took place in the Indian side, or at least he made this propaganda through his news channels, through the media, that he is the one who has been, won the way into Pakistan, did destroy the Pakistan in terror camps in Balakot, and these were never challenged. Even a POW, which was something supposed to be anywhere in the world, the country would have asked, how come your plane got down and you gave a POW to a so-called quote-unquote enemy country? But nobody asked these questions. So then he made Balakot as a huge success story. He put together the Hindu chauvinism or Hindu supremacy, at the same time, ultra-nationalism, which is anti-Pakistan, to read it. So when these two combine, that has really given him the victory. And on that ground, we must realize now he is the boy working for RSS. So RSS has now the legitimate right to push for the agenda, which is anti-Muslim and anti-Pakistan. So this is what they wanted. Now they have got a mandate for it. And on that basis, such a huge mandate, than even much more than 2014. So on what ground the so-called liberals are dreaming that he will be okay, it will be business as usual, and they will get the chance to change the government in a regular process and restrict and to sort of make it the Indian secular inclusive Ambedkar constitution survive? I don't know.
You're painting a very bleak picture. But what you're saying is very interesting, and 2 points I would like you to clarify. One is that you're saying that until December, there wasn't really a groundswell. Now, obviously, it's a counterfactual because Pulwama happened and Balakot happened and the rest of it. So it's interesting. Yesterday, we were trying to make this point about the Congress performance in Chhattisgarh, in Madhya Pradesh, and also in Rajasthan. But there was also a sense from some of the Indian analysts that state election results can be different from national election results. So once again, it's something that cannot be proved. But the other thing, please tell me, how did Balakot redound to Modi's advantage? And I ask because the military adventure was a disaster. Not only the Indian Air Force coming in, and after being chased by the Pakistan Air Force, dropping their payload, going back, and the next day, the PF strikes targets inside occupied Kashmir, and then, of course, we down one of the Indian MiGs. So how did Modi manage to sell this disaster as a big success?
Because he put it a story that, he could get into Pakistan. That's what the fighter planes did it in the night. But then he kept it in somehow there was no evidence were given for the target which he claimed, and the many people gave the number that 350 to 500, 200 terrorists were being killed, but it was never given evidences. Of course, Pakistan is supposed to deny it. I mean, in that sense. But the international agencies, most of the international press also denied that it hasn't hit the target. But what happened? That sort of news, the opposition should have asked these questions when the Balakot happened. But opposition got stunned. Opposition didn't know how to react. Opposition gave him 2 weeks to take the narrative out of their hand. And I think that's where they did the mistake. They didn't realize that by giving the Balakot, which is not exactly what he is claiming is the right, by giving him that, they gave him the possibility to take the credit. And after 2 weeks, when they started questioning him, that lost the relevance because he has already taken that out. So in that sense, he managed, because he of course has been, look at the helicopter which went down by the friendly fire. Any stupid person could get that within a minute, that this was happened because of our missiles. But what happened? It was been there for 3 months, and now gradually they are realizing. So the Indian Air Force also didn't, kept the information secret. So this was helping him. So this was all a kind of things. Opposition fell into his trap.
Absolutely. In fact, now that you talk about the Indian helicopter that was shot down by friendly fire, Colonel Ajay Shukla had written that the Indian Air Force Court of Inquiry had been asked by the government to not bring out the findings until the end of the elections, because they did not want this news to negatively impact the process of voting. Of course, the Indian Air Force then denied this, but Ajay Shukla stood by his story. But finally, Professor Swain, before I let you go, give me a sense of how do you think, like, the broad contours of India in the next 5 years?
I think it's a question which is maybe $1 trillion question, where the India will lead to. But frankly, even if I try really hard, it's very difficult for me to be positive to think about it, because considering the last 5 years, of course, I have been following Modi's politics from before he became the Gujarat Chief Minister. And after he became the Gujarat Chief Minister, everyone knows, those who are following his politics, where he stands. And then the people stayed with even the liberals, even the media, larger part of media, who still believes that under the grab of this electoral democracy, they thought that he will change after 2014. He didn't, in spite of the promise that he said something else. But now he has the mandate to do whatever he wants to do, or whatever he has been trained to do under the RSS. And the RSS has the mandate to follow the kind of Hindu Rashtra, the idea which has been there. Why they upset with Nehru? Because Nehru was the one who really didn't let them do it. And that's where the secular India, if anyone thinks is not in danger, they are probably living in the Lala's land. So the secular India is seriously in danger. The way it will be most likely a Hindu Rashtra is in the coming, because if RSS doesn't able to do it in these 5 years, we'll never able to do it. So RSS knows that this is the 5 years where the Hindu Rashtra will come. And we don't know what will happen to the 200 million Muslims. We don't know what will happen to Kashmir. And we don't know what will happen. That kind of relationship with the Kashmir will lead to the relationship with Pakistan and China.
That will also require the amendment to the Constitution, changing the entire nature of the Constitution. But thank you so much, Professor Ashok Swain, talking to us about what has happened in India. Moeed, what do you think of what Ashok Swain is saying?
Look, I mean, Ejaz, I don't think it's a $1 trillion question. I think we've seen this movie play out before in many countries. The end is never good. So it depends where you sit and what you want to see from this. If you're BJP, if you're RSS, if you're the right wing of India, this is as good as it gets. There will be moves for constitutional changes. Whether they happen or not is a separate discussion. I was one of those. I was in India in December when these upset victories, Congress scored these upset victories in 3 states. Even then, it was clear that the Congress itself couldn't believe they'd won. They had no strategy. It was a complete surprise. And quite frankly, Congress deserves to lose. I mean, they've had no real opposition strategy throughout the 5 years of Modi. He's made mistake after mistake. He came in on a platform of economic revival. Hasn't happened. The Hindu-Muslim sort of situation has gotten worse. And Congress is basically, unfortunately, rather than playing its left, it's gone and jumped onto the bandwagon, going to mandirs and showing that it can be more right than the BJP. Nobody can be more right than the BJP in India. And if you can, you don't deserve to be in politics. You should just join them. I mean, it makes no sense. So they didn't have a strategy. That said, quite frankly, India is in trouble. It's as simple as that. Nowhere in the world has this kind of ideology delivered harmony within society. And I think that's very clear. There's no real debate about this in my mind. The question really is, does this further move to the right, become violent? Does it create discord within India to a point where the state starts using heavy-handed measures like it uses in Kashmir every day? Or does it bulldoze this in a way that the opposition basically can't stand up? Both are terrible places to be if you're an Indian minority, Indian Muslim, Indian liberal. But to me, these are the 2 questions to ask. If I was sitting in Srinagar today, I'd be very, very, very worried. Disappointed is another question. I'd be very worried because the agenda is very clear. How far they get, again, depends on what kind of pushback they get. I think if I'm Pakistan, quite frankly, I can see this both ways. One way to look at this is Pakistan's been offering dialogue for months and months now. There's no movement. You know that I've written, we've talked about this on your program. In the short run, I think there will be opportunities. The isolate Pakistan model didn't work. I think Modi will open up some space.
I'm going to come to India-Pakistan. But let's go back to, I want to, for now, focus on India itself. Now, Marshal Tito, for instance, put together Yugoslavia in a certain kind of way. He was a Croat himself, but gave a certain Serb-Slav identity to Yugoslavia. Now, these are, at one level, artificial constructs. And when the crunch comes, these fault lines appear. They're used as markers. And then we saw what happened to Yugoslavia. Now, India, until the arrival on these shores of the British, not even the Mughal Empire completely controlled India administratively.
Yeah.
It was the British who did this. So, in a post-colonial scenario, we got the Western idea of the nation state.
Yeah.
More a state nation than a nation state.
Yeah.
Congeries of nation.
Yeah.
And that is where Nehru, Ambedkar and others came in and thought that, the secular inclusive model could work. In fact, that's the only model that's likely to work.
Yeah.
Now, that model has unraveled.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, and you can agree with me if you think that I'm right.
Never.
Never. But here's the thing. Yesterday I was thinking I was trying to go back in time and trying to see how the Muslims of India looked at the idea of the post-British, sort of Brexit, so to speak. The first Brexit happened in 1947.
Yeah.
How did they think, and the demand for Pakistan, or the autonomous region, and ultimately Pakistan, is it same kind of moment, like in terms of unraveling of that Nehruvian model?
See, I keep telling you on and off there, your problem is you read too much. You're in the wrong country for that. Look, this current situation, what has happened, Modi, the RSS and the clan, none of this matters. It's a very simple, clear agenda. Go back and read RSS's ethos.
Yeah.
I think Hitler would shiver.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right? Even if you get 5% of the way there, the country is in trouble, the minorities are in trouble, and there's going to be instability.
Yeah.
Right? So what are we hoping for? What we are hoping for is that a government that's just won a majority has come in big time, proving that they are the representatives of the Indian people, whichever way we come at this, now should behave themselves and go in a direction that their ideology challenges. That makes no sense to me. Right? This is the same argument that there'll be a US president who's saying whatever he's saying in campaign. When he comes, he'll be a different human being. Well, hasn't happened, right? It's not going to happen here either. For all the conversation about Indian institutions and international image and whatever, we know that things work in South Asia a certain way, right? And in that, the state has any number of tools to push things in the direction they want. The question to my mind is whether they ask for too much too soon, get pushback, and the project doesn't work out, which is probably the best case scenario, or they do it very meticulously, do it carefully, and they get where they want at the end of the next 5 years, which would be a complete disaster. So, there's a lot to be depressed about this. The most important point that people are not picking up, and I don't know why, at least from everything I've seen. Look, in 2014, Modi ran on a platform which said Congress failed. That was the line, right? Yeah. And Manmohan Singh is weak.
Dynastic,
right?
Corruption
economy terrible, blah, blah,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, yeah.
This time, they did not run on that because there wasn't an economy to put out.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, what would he juxtapose?
Correct.
Like the highest unemployment rate in 20 years?
So now we talk about Balakot. Let's say Balakot didn't happen. He was still running a campaign. On what? On a right-wing agenda, on a divisive political agenda. Yeah. That's what's gotten him there. And then he's peppered that with Balakot and this and that and whatever, right? If you've won an election based on that, and you've got a right-wing violent force attached to you, this is your moment.
Could it also be, and this is a possibility, I mean, there are two broad scenarios here. One is, of course, that you do more of the same and more, which would obviously be the worst case scenario in terms of highlighting the fault lines. And the other could be that I needed this in order to get back to power. And here I am, the only non-Congress person to have actually got a second term with greater majority. So now is the time for me to tell the RSS people, you guys got to relax because I have a bigger project to handle.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're talking of Atal Bihari Vajpayee then. I mean, Modi has shown something in 5 years. Many people thought of this in the beginning as well. He hasn't gone that way, right? So I'm not sanguine, quite frankly. The other thing I'll put to you is to keep in mind, if I am the Indian opposition, if I'm the Indian liberal, I would actually consider the worst case scenario to be most realistic and work off that. I would start preparing for that and see what I can do to prevent that from happening. If I'm the Indian government and if that's the conversation, I would tell them, make sure you do what you are saying. And you hope it's somewhere in the middle. But look, at the end of the day, I don't think we need to mince words here. This is a complete disaster for anybody who wanted to see a somewhat stable, inclusive neighborhood and an improved India-Pakistan relationship. The other disaster is for India. And that's where I would really worry if I were thinking of this as an Indian liberal. India's entire economic growth model is built on a soft image.
Yes.
This is very unlike Pakistan, where actually the whole problem is image.
Absolutely.
Right? Or not whole, but a lot of it. That's built on a soft image. That's built on this aura of internal, quote-unquote, investor stability, if you will.
Absolutely.
Certainty, right?
Aesthetics,
Correct.
the arts, films and the rest of it, inclusiveness, secularism.
That is going to go for a 6. If this model goes even 5% of the way it wants to go, right? That's really what's going to do this. Now, all of this said, what are you looking at? You're looking at the largest country in the region, supposedly wanting to be the leader, the hegemon, actually crumbling under its own weight. Not in terms of disappearing or whatever, but becoming weaker.
But here's the problem, and I have to take a break, so I leave this thought with you. That's the kind of thing where you wag the dog.
Yeah.
So if you're going to wag the dog, then something like Balakot can happen again.
Correct.
And that is where we return, after the break, we'll return to what are we looking at in terms of India-Pakistan relations. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing, obviously, the BJP win in India and the fact that this was a high tide of mostly the right-wing Hindutva agenda. What does it mean for India? And how are we going to look at India-Pakistan relations as we move forward? But briefly, before we get to India-Pakistan, the Americans have very clearly put some eggs in the Indian basket, which has less to do with India per se. Of course, there's a market and the rest of it, but it has a lot to do with the rising power of China. Now, if India moves further towards the right, if there's violence, there are institutionally in the US spaces which are not particularly keen and don't have to necessarily go along with the executive policy. Although the executive policy is very weighty within the US system, but it could become problematic for the US.
It could. First of all, look, I mean, I'll say this. I think the US-India relationship is not nearly as cozy as people here make it out to be.
Yeah,
you wake up and think about this as, oh, they're in bed, in cahoots, doing everything together. They have tons of problems. It's not a natural alliance, but China brings the US and India together. I think this is a point that needs to be kept in mind. Yes, I think if India moves in the direction that we are suspecting or are worried about, there will be issues. I mean, whatever one may say, the US has very strong left-leaning lobbies. There are issues of human rights, whether it comes up as regularly as it should is another question. Also, India is a large market. It's a very lucrative market. It's not a natural market. It's not the only market. So if things don't work out the way they're supposed to, yes, there'll be complications. Also, China is in a full court press to make sure that India doesn't jump completely in the US camp, right? So if that starts happening, the Chinese are much less sensitive to violence than the West is. And you actually would probably see the Chinese finding an opportunity to make sure that India is not completely in India's camp, even more so. But what you should be sure of, Ejaz, we are headed for major changes. This idea of a clear alliance structure, US-China, US-India, Pakistan-China, I think you're going to be now testing these waters again. Iran is already a big problem for India, as it is for Pakistan, in terms of where that tension goes. So I think there are going to be changes. If you're going to come to Pakistan, the first thing I'll say is that Pakistan needs to be patient and see how these things play out.
So let me just, I just put down a list. Starting with, should we continue, since you mentioned that we've been constantly talking about dialogue. So should we continue with our position of asking for dialogue with India, knowing that it's a government that has actually ridden the high tide of Pakistan bashing? But I also asked this, interestingly, and I know that you've read that piece by Ashley Tellis, and I'm going to quote from this. So the title, and this is a 2017 Carnegie paper that he wrote, and it was titled, "Are India-Pakistan Peace Talks Worth a Damn?" And his opening sentence is the international community's routine call for continuous India-Pakistan dialogue is not only misguided, but also counterproductive. And then he goes on to argue that, essentially what he's saying is that India doesn't need to do this, the US has to side with India and blah, blah, blah. And the fact is that Pakistan needs to be put in its place. So let's start with this. So we had the composite dialogue, then we had post-Mumbai, the resumed dialogue. Then in 2015, we had the comprehensive bilateral dialogue. Where do we go from here if we are going anywhere at all?
Yeah, when Ashley Tellis says this, he's a strategic analyst par excellence. When Moeed Yusuf says the opposite, is a Pakistani stooge. Welcome to the independence of Washington.
US policy thinking and community.
Look, I mean, I think everybody's entitled to their view. I've argued publicly and made myself very unpopular arguing this, but I truly believe this is a position that's in the US interest and Pakistan's interest. The US gains absolutely nothing by forcing Pakistan into China's camp completely. It makes no sense. This is exactly the mistake the US made in 1989. 12 years down the line, there was a 9/11 and Pakistan was needed day in, day out, right? The same thing's going to happen again. You can't isolate a country just because you feel like it. But the venom right now, the vitriol rhetoric against Pakistan is so deep that I am convinced this relationship will break, okay? I will also say, I don't think people here in Pakistan who have worked this over the years really understand the US system. And so the combination is a fairly bad one, to be very honest. Anyways, that said, I think Pakistan should continue to propose dialogue. Pakistan should engage in dialogue if it comes. Because look, the global narrative remained for a long time that Pakistan is the problem, India is the peace-loving country, right? For the past year, nobody has been able to say this because Pakistan's constantly said, we are willing to talk, right? And I think that position remains as sacrosanct as it was before. Pakistan should continue to offer this, get into dialogue very seriously if it opens up, because ultimately it benefits Pakistan, it benefits India even more if India were to really think about this seriously. I don't think it's about to happen. I think there'll be short bursts of opportunity, but in the long run, I've said this before, India is playing a long game where it says 10 years down the line, I will not need to talk to Pakistan if the power differential keeps going.
Absolutely, and strategies of coercion kick into play. We'll come to that also. But let me go back to a discussion we have had multiple times, which is about Pakistan doing something which India did not expect it to do in terms of a reach out or in terms of essentially something that puts India in a tight spot.
Yeah.
An example of that could be the Kartarpur Sahib thing.
Yeah.
You think that that is something that we have the spaces for that? Because to me, it looks more like a well thought out strategic move and not something where you are genuflecting to India or you're capitulating or anything. It's just that you are indicating to the rest of the world that we are the ones who are taking the initiative and India is the spoiler here.
Look, I mean, this capitulation business, how long are we going to continue with this? Any sensible thing that we do anywhere in this country.
You watch our channels.
Well, good luck. That's why I'm not there. Look, the point is, any sensible thing this country does is capitulation. Any crazy thing it does is nationalism. It doesn't make any sense. I think Kartarpur was ultimately exactly the right thing. From a human perspective, from a national perspective, from a strategic perspective, it makes perfect sense. Why shouldn't there be openings which actually benefit both sides? And Pakistan is genuinely coming across as the country that's saying we can do something without changing the strategic equation. We should absolutely do that. I am one of those who had argued that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif should have gone to Prime Minister Modi's initial inauguration in 2014. If an invitation comes tomorrow, I'll say the same thing.
Okay.
Right? But
I was, in fairness and in full disclosure,
I remember.
I was
as
opposed
usual,
to it.
You were wrong again.
No, I was opposed to it because, the very next day I was proven right, but that's a separate issue. We're not going to...
that would mean that I was proven wrong,
We're not going to get into that discussion on this. But I'm happy that you said this. Because if an invitation comes tomorrow, I still stand by the fact that, for instance, the Speaker of the National Assembly or someone else should go, not the Prime Minister.
Yeah, you can't do that, right? I mean, if they're inviting
Reason, because the entire thing will be choreographed by the Indian side.
Yeah, but if you're inviting the heads of state from all countries, you don't. I don't think you have the option diplomatically to do that. The point I'm making is different. What happened last time, and the reason you may have been proven right, is not because you were right. It was a fluke. And the reason
it wasn't a fluke. It was because of the cussedness of the Indian side.
Yeah, so I'll tell you the problem. The problem is, last time what happened was, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif went from here, taking a huge political hit. Yeah. If you remember, there was a lot of opposition. People like you and others were saying this. The international narrative that became of that move was that, look, Prime Minister Modi has taken such a big risk by inviting the Pakistani Prime Minister. So, if you're going to do this, the point is the move of going is absolutely right, but you need to make sure that the international audiences understand that the real risk is here.
Correct.
Right? Now going and meeting a BJP leader who's been bashing Pakistan for 6 months and lying about Balakot, the risk is here. That's the conversation to change.
Well, this time there's not too much risk, by the way.
Sure,
and I'm not even going to get into that.
But I think the engagement part
Yeah.
is absolutely crucial. I think Pakistan gains nothing by not engaging, by not saying that we want to engage. I think that narrative should continue. And I will also tell you, every time India refuses, India loses out. So to me, it's a win-win.
Okay, so going further from here, let's assume that Modi indicates a preference for limited dialogue. And when I say limited dialogue, I'm assuming he says we're only going to talk about terrorism. And once we've settled that, then we can go back to the comprehensive bilateral
Yeah, I mean, look,
dialogue.
that's a non-starter. The bottom line again, let me just, I think Pakistan's got it right after a long time in the past year, which is, I am the one who's willing to go out on a limb and have this conversation. If India is saying no, you have the narrative on your side. If India says yes and there's genuine engagement, it's good for both countries, right?
No, but
now,
hold on,
terrorism will be talked about.
No, hold on.
But
of course, terrorism is part of
it
the
has to be.
But here's the thing. When you say it's a non-starter, I mean, it's a non-starter in the sense that if Modi front loads limited dialogue with the idea of terrorism, he still has the space, unfortunately, in terms of international acceptance of his approach to terrorism and his definition of terrorism.
Yeah, that's fair.
That then redounds to Pakistan's disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think the narrative battle, you're going to have an advantage for the first time in a long time, because where things internally in India will go, and we've talked about this, there are going to be many more opportunities for the world to point fingers at what happens. Look, Kashmir is peculiar. The reality is the world doesn't care, unfortunately. Whatever's happening in Kashmir, had it happened somewhere else, there could be many, many different reactions. Mainstream India is not the same. I don't think you can look the other way when you have billions of dollars of investment coming in from your country to say, I really don't care what happens, right? When this kind of unrest happens, we know what happens. Businesses are not secure. Certainty doesn't exist, right? All countries who go through this will hurt. And India has to understand this point. When it does, the world will have a different view. Now, if the view here remains, or somebody has this in their mind, no matter what, the world is out to kill Pakistan because it's anti-Muslim, it's anti-Pakistan, then okay. If you're willing to lose that opportunity, that's your problem. But
no, then of course then essentially we are caught in the same kind of xenophobia, which we are talking about with reference to
which
to
we are
India.
trying to get out of here, right? I mean, we've seen this movie play out.
I was going to say, I mean, in fact, I was reading something very interesting, which Dr. Ilhan Niaz wrote. He tweeted that India's future, if you want to look at India's future, look at Pakistan's history. So, and I think he's right in many ways. But assuming that if the idea of the limited dialogue is broadened just a little bit more in terms of the fact that yes, there are and now since the comprehensive bilateral dialogue, they're called pillars. Call them pillars or baskets, what's in a name, as Shakespeare said. But the point really is that there is, for instance, India wants a greater movement on the issue of terrorism, on the issue of trade, for instance, on the issue of certain other things, very little to do with Kashmir, very little to do with Siachen, very little to do with Sir Creek.
Yeah, I think you're jumping the gun here. So when I say dialogue, I'm not looking at problem solving. I think that's way in the future.
Okay, that's very interesting.
I don't think this is a Manmohan Singh Musharraf dialogue. In my mind, that's not what it is.
Okay.
I think it's more polemics.
Okay.
I think it's more a conversation. I think it is one more tripwire to prevent a crisis. And I think it is more about making sure that there's not so much acrimony all the time that the eastern border for Pakistan is hot.
So we're talking about, so when you say it's a trip, so we're talking about some kind of cushion to manage a crisis. We're not
Yeah,
talking
some
about
kind of cushion which prevents it from falling apart. That's my sort of limit of my optimism on the relationship right now. I'm not thinking of the
right now.
Yeah.
But okay, so we have another 5 years of Modi, at least 5 years. So we're talking about starting this, let's say for another year and a half as just an idea of crisis management mechanism.
Yeah, it's more just testing the waters.
But at some point, it has to, because you are basically what you're saying, and I agree with you. You actually, short of talking the talk even, forget about walking the talk.
Yeah.
You're just saying that it gives you a space in which you can try and manage a crisis. That's the maximum we're looking at.
Not
right
get there. Look, I mean, let's pull back. I mean, this maybe is too candid for a TV conversation, but what are we thinking of here? From my point of view, if you're Pakistan, the only thing you're thinking right now is how do I get enough space to do what I want to do internally and with the rest of the world so that I can grow at 6, 7, 8%. That's the mindset, right?
Correct.
You're not solving any sort of major issue in the next 5 years. I don't think that's going to happen, okay? Right now, the problem is that the differential is growing economically. There's no question. That's why the defense expenditures are so warped on the two sides. It is also true that you are going to pick up more and more evidence of Indian fishing in Pakistan. Okay? The mindset that's on the other side, you're going to pick more of that. And here is where my argument becomes very difficult. I say you still need to keep finding space to talk so that you can do other things more comfortably. The conventional wisdom rightly is, here is what I've picked up, here is what they've done, here is what they've done, and you are asking me to keep talking. Right? This is the catch-22 that Pakistan is in. But if I'm India, I want Pakistan to think exactly like that. Pick up something and say, oh, India did this, we can't talk to them. Oh, India did this, that's it. And the differential keeps growing. The goal is reducing.
So what we are saying is, and I have other questions also, but I think we've broadly covered this. So what you're saying is that we have to, in terms of what India is doing, for instance, the kind of covert activities it is doing in Balochistan or what was erstwhile FATA, we have to operationally, through our intelligence, deal with that, neutralize that, but not to use Kulbhushan Jadhav as a metaphor, not turn Jadhav into the metaphor for the broader umbrella India-Pakistan relation.
Here is what I would say. Separate the tactical from the strategic and don't conflate it. Deal with the tactical where you need to deal with it, whichever way you do. Countries' intelligence, security, I don't know that business. People are doing this, they need to do that. Don't let that color the larger question of how you are going to reduce the differential or at least keep it manageable so that 15 years down the line, you're not at a point where there can be no conversation, right? That space has to be separated from the day-to-day. We haven't been good at it in the past. That's, I think, where we need to go. And the one thing I'll tell you, it will never happen. It can never happen for anything, not only India, Pakistan, economy, social sector, unless you bring in spaces and opportunities for real strategic thinking in the system. If the entire system is geared to firefight every day, it is impossible for you to pull back and start looking at the larger picture.
Yeah,
That's been one of our biggest weaknesses.
Moeed, here's the problem. In terms of the form of it, I'm not talking about the substance. I totally agree with you when it comes to the substance of strategic thinking. Bureaucracies are for firefighting.
Correct.
And large-scale bureaucratic organizations are obviously afflicted by bounded rationality also.
Fair enough.
We have created certain think tanks, but the problem is that it's not like Rand telling the Pentagon that what you're doing, because there's a Brody sitting there and there are others sitting there who are telling Pentagon that these policies that you are pursuing are not the right policy. Whereas what we have here is to try and give an intellectual underpinning to what is already being formulated.
But look, I do not think this will happen outside the system. I do not think the US model will work. And I can give you reasons, we don't have time. I think we need to go in two directions very specifically. One, what the other countries call the revolving door. Bring in private sector for a year, 2 years, get them to give you the new ideas, where the world is going, instill that and let the bureaucrats then use that in their firefighting. And second, create hubs of strategic thinking within the public sector, within the system. So ideally, if I were to design a model...
But here's the thing. I mean, it's again the problem of space. Because Hina Rabbani Kar tried this. She did this as public diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also brought in a legal advisor, an international law expert. The public diplomacy side...
this is the start. Look, you need sustainability of these things. And one thing I'll tell you, people, when I say this, people say, nobody will listen. There's no culture. Agreed. But there's a flip side to this. In the US, I sit in one of the most prominent sort of intellectual spaces, think tanks, whatever. If my policy input is taken up 1% of the time, I'm king. You know why? The system has capability. They have their own thinking models. There are millions of think tanks around. Why would they come to a person and ask? In Pakistan, it's the opposite. If you come up with really good ideas, my experience is people will say, please come and help. Please do this.
Okay.
Because we don't have the capacity. So I think we can do that. But let me just say this. We are falling behind the world every single day because we are making the same mistakes over and over. We have the same model, same people, same firefighting. Cannot do that. The world has moved on.
Okay. Moeed, I have to say this. It's been a fantastic discussion. This particular point about what we need to do is something that I would want to have you on a program along with a couple of other people, and we need to discuss it at length. This is all for today and this week. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.